Properties. By the end of this lesson, you're going to need to be able to recognize the properties of equality and identity, as well as recognizing commutative and associative properties. A lot of what we're going to talk about today will be review, especially if you remember back to pre-algebra last year when we talked about a lot of these. Last year, those of you that were in my class was pretty much everybody. You remember a silly little story I told about going to a place to buy property?
Yeah.
And okay, yeah, there was the guy pulling a trailer, and no matter what order he hooked up his trailers, he had the same number of trailers. And then there was Big Al's associative animal farm. No matter how he grouped his animals, he had the same number of animals. Okay, so that's all. That story I'll be referring back to that as well. So a lot of this, especially at the beginning, is just review stuff. And we're going to talk about the different properties that you should pretty well already know. Commutative property tells us that the order in which you add or multiply numbers does not change the sum or the product. This only works if you are only adding or only multiplying. You can't combine multiplication and addition. If you are adding only or multiplying only, order doesn't matter. So the key word for commutative property is order. Look to see if the order is changed in the problem or can be changed, and that is the commutative property. Okay, this was the guy pulling his trailers, and no matter what order he hooked up the trailers, he had the same number of trailers. So commutative property is all about order. Next, and I could just even write that in there if I'm... Okay, next, we're going to talk about the associative property. Again, you guys should be very familiar with this because we spent a lot of time on it last year. The way you group three or more numbers when adding or multiplying does not change the sum or product. How do we group things in math? What symbol do we use? Parentheses, thank you. All right, so parentheses is the way you group things in math. So in order for the associative property even to be in effect or even to be a possible answer, you have to have parentheses involved. Okay, that doesn't mean if parentheses are there, that's the only property you can use. We can still use other properties when parentheses are being used. But if we're going to use associative property, we have to do something with parentheses. Okay, and you guys know the math of this already. I know you know it. 3 plus 5 grouped together plus 7 is the same as 3 plus 5 plus 7 grouped together. It's the same thing. You know that already. The key word with associative property is group. It's how we group things together. So check the grouping, see if we can change it or if it has been changed in order for it to be associative property. All right. We also talked about both of these properties last year in pre-algebra. So again, this is all review. I'm not showing you a lot of new stuff here. The additive identity. In the story I told you, I went to two houses. They were the identity houses. Remember that?
Yes.
And the first one, the address was?
0.
And the windows look like?
Plus
signs. When you add 0, you don't change the identity of the thing involved. Okay, that's the additive identity. Additive identity is adding 0. Additive inverse, we also talked about a little bit later in the year last year with pre-algebra. Every number has an additive inverse. And when you add a number and its additive inverse, the sum should be 0. So if I give you a number, you tell me the additive inverse. What is the additive inverse of 2?
-2.
-2. What is the additive inverse of -47?
47.
Positive 47, okay? What is the additive inverse of 2 and 2/3?
Negative
2 and 2/3.
Negative 2 and 2/3. It's just that simple. That's additive inverse, okay? And so we will do things with the additive inverse property to show that we know what's going on there. All right? Next, multiplication properties. Very similar to what we just talked about with addition. There was also an identity house that had an address,
1.
and its windows looked like
Multiplication.
symbols. When you multiply by 1, you don't change the identity of the original number that you started with. Multiplicative property of 0. In that part of the story, we had a guy who ran an ice house, and he had invented a machine that when the temperature got too high or too low, it went zap back to 0. Remember the zap? Okay. All right. So multiplicative property of 0. Anytime you multiply by 0, the product is 0. Simple enough. Multiplicative inverse. We talked about this last year when we were in the unit on fractions. Multiplicative inverse also has another fancy name. Starts with R, ends with reciprocal. Reciprocal, good job. All right. So reciprocal is the kind of another word that we use for multiplicative inverse. Every number has a multiplicative inverse. And when you multiply a number by its multiplicative inverse, what do you want the product to be?
0.
Not 0.
1.
1. There you
Oh,
go.
I got it right.
So what is the multiplicative inverse of 8? No, that's the product.
8.
8 times, what's the reciprocal of 8? Not negative 8.
Positive 8.
8 over 1 is the number we're starting with. What's the
1 over 8.
reciprocal?
1 over 8.
It's 1 over, it's positive because it's got to be a positive 1 for the product. Okay? So what is the multiplicative inverse of negative 2/3?
Positive 3 over 2.
Not positive because you want it to be a positive product.
Negative 3 over 2.
Negative 3 over 2
Okay.
times negative 3 over 2. It should have the same sign, but it's just going to be the number flipped over. That's a multiplicative inverse. That's the reciprocal. Okay, every number has a multiplicative inverse, just like every number has an additive inverse. All right, here I think these are the new properties. These are 3 of these 4 properties you've never seen before. So this is kind of the new material, but they're really, really simple. Okay, the reflexive property, any quantity is equal to itself. 4 is equal to what?
4.
4. It equals itself. That's the reflexive property. It's so simple you don't even think about it. But 4 is equal to 4. Any number is equal to itself. It's got to be, otherwise math doesn't work, right?
True.
True. All right, the symmetric property. If one quantity equals the second quantity, then the second quantity equals the first. That just means if A equals B, then B equals A.
Boom.
Okay? It's so simple, you don't even think about it being a property, but it's one of the foundational things on which math works. If that doesn't work, then math is broken, and we get to go home early.
Oh, yay.
Okay?
Yay!
So,
Let's make it not work.
unfortunately, for your sakes, it's not going to break. We'll be able to do that all the time. So, symmetric property, it goes both directions. If A equals B, then B equals A. And my favorite of the 3 that we're learning today is the transitive property. Transitive property kind of gets a little more complicated, but basically it means this. If A equals B and B equals C,
Then A equals C.
then A has to equal C also. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So if A equals B and B equals C, then A has to equal C. You get to line things up in a row, and if one equals another, and it equals the next, and it equals the next, then you can associate all those things together as being equal. Okay? That's the transitive property. The very first property that we learned last year in pre-algebra was the substitution property. And we've been using this one already this last week. That's just in problems like, what is 3 plus A if A equals 7? What do I do with the A?
You change it to
Change
a
it
seven.
to-
Not change it, use the math word.
You
Substitute.
You substitute 7 for A, so it's 3 plus 7 equals 10. Okay, it's substitution property of equality. We've been using that one since the very beginning of last year. All right, now, all of these properties, and here's what we're going to do. Last year in pre-algebra, what we did with the properties was pretty simple. We just demonstrated that we were able to use them, but we didn't really have to label them in a whole lot. Now that we're in algebra, we're going to take it another step, and we're actually going to label each property as we use it in simplifying expressions. Okay, so here we go. I have 2 examples. You can follow along in your notes. 14 plus 3 times the quantity of 2 minus 4 times 0.5 plus 7 times 1/7. So we're going to take one step at a time, and every step that we take, as we simplify this expression, we're going to state what property we used, okay? Where do I have to start in simplifying, Addison?
You have to take 2 minus 4 times 0.5.
Okay, what one thing do I need to do first? Because we're gonna do one step at a time.
Is minus what?
Order of operations.
Well, isn't it in the parentheses?
It's in the
It's
parentheses.
not
No, in the parentheses, you have to do the order of operations too.
So multiplication.
Multiplication has to come before subtraction. All right, so multiplication always comes before subtraction. So inside the parentheses, we're gonna multiply first. So we will do this, just one step at a time is all we're doing here. 2 minus, what is 4 times 0.05?
2.
2. Plus 7 times 1/7. Okay. Now what step, or this, I'm gonna go ahead and start us off. We just used a property. And this is kind of the broadest, largest category property that we're gonna use. And you can almost use this property on every step, except that on some of these steps, we're gonna get more specific, so I want you to get more specific with the property name. This property was substitution. Four times 0.5, if we just write that up here, 4 times 0.5, that equals 2, doesn't it? Okay, and the substitution property says that if you have two quantities that are equal, you can substitute one for the other. So I took this quantity right here and I substituted a 2 in for it. So that was substitution property. That's all we did. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so now what step do I need to do, Annabelle?
You have to do 2 minus 2.
2 minus 2 is inside the parentheses, I've got to do it next. So 14 plus 3 times, what's 2 minus 2? 0 plus 7 times 1/7. Okay, what property did I just use? Substitution, once again, okay? Substitution. Okay. Now things are going to get a little more interesting. All right. Look at this. Look at the expression I have. What do I need to do next? Order of operations.
7 times 1/7.
Okay. 7 times 1/7. But what's also happening here?
3 times 0.
3 times 0. That's multiplication. So I've got order of operations says multiplication goes in one step from left to right, correct?
Correct.
So we're going to do two different steps, but we're going to name them both with properties. So 14 plus, what's 3 times 0?
0.
Plus, what's 7 times 1/7?
Oh.
7.
7. No, not 7.
14.
I'm totally guessing. I don't know.
14.
We just talked about it on this slide. What's 7 times 1/7?
Oh, 1.
1. It's the multiplicative inverse, right? Whoops, wrong slide. So 7 times 1/7 is 1. All right. So we did 2 steps here, which means we've got to label 2 properties. 3 times 0 is what property? Multiplicative property of?
Inverse.
No, not inverse.
0?
Multiplicative property of 0. Multiplicative property of 0. And we also did 7 times 1/7. What property is that? Look back at your sheet if you have to. You know where the notes are at. I just showed you where they were. Inverse, exactly right. Multiplicative inverse property. Okay? So these 2 properties were used in one step, and that's okay. Now, I've got 2 steps left. When I have order of operations says when I have addition, I work left to right, correct? We're going to do this in 2 steps. What's 14 plus 0?
14.
14 plus 1. What is that property? 14 plus 0 is 14.
The,
Additive identity. Okay, identity property of addition would be another way to say it. Additive identity. And now what is 14 plus 1? Okay, we kind of end where we started up here. What did I just do? Took two quantities that were equal and I substituted 15 in for 14 plus 1. So this one is substitution. All right. Is that a whole bunch of work?
Yes.
Yes. Does that kind of stretch your brain a little bit? Little bit. That's okay. Am I going to make you do this all year long where you have to name the properties?
Yes.
No. You don't have to name them step by step as you go all year long. But for now, as we're simplifying, as we're doing these things, I want you to be thinking in terms of properties and what properties you're using. So for now, for the next assignment or two, we are going to be doing this. And you're going to have to label every step what property you're using. Let's do one more example. Evaluate the expression, name the property used in each step. One of the great things about understanding the properties is that you can use them to help make mental math easier. Okay? This is all multiplication. So do I have to do it in this order?
Yes.
No.
No.
No. What property lets me change the order of multiplication? Keyword order.
Order of operations.
Keyword order. Commutative property. Commutative property lets me change the order. So I can do this. I can do 0.
What you would do, it would equal the same exact thing.
It doesn't matter what order I multiply it in, I'm still going to get the same answer. 0.5 times 8 times 0.2 times 5. I'm going to change the order. Now, not only am I going to change the order, which was commutative property, I'm going to add some grouping symbols. What property is that? Keyword group.
Commutative?
We just did commutative, that was keyword order.
Associative.
Associative property. So I used two properties in one move here, that's okay. Now the reason I did that is because now I can do this all mentally. What is 0.5 or half? What is half of 8?
4.
4, very simple. Times, what is 0.2 times 5?
0.25.
Nope. What's 2 times 5?
2.5. It's 2.5.
What's 2 times 5?
10.
10, but you have a decimal involved.
1.5.
1.
1.
What?
It's 1. All right? So, you're going to have to think about that one a little bit.
Wouldn't it be
Not yet. We just did this one. 0.5 times 8 is 4. What would you call that? That's that big, generic, broad property.
I don't know.
Substitution.
Substitution. You guys are struggling here. That's okay though. All right, substitution. Now, one of the properties, we just used a property here. One of the properties says something about the product being 1. Go back and look at them. You want the product to be 1 when you multiply two things.
Oh, the
multiplicative.
Not identity.
Inverse.
Inverse, multiplicative inverse. This is weird. This is weird because we have a decimal and a whole number, but it's still multiplicative inverse because our property was 1. What is 0.2? 0.2 as a fraction? It's 2 over 10, which simplifies to 1 over 5. We just took 1 over 5 times 5. That's multiplicative inverse. We got a 1 as the product. So we did substitution and we used multiplicative, I can't talk and write this word at the same time. Multiplicative inverse.
Are you still recording?
Yes. Okay, now, multiplicative inverse. We've got one more step. What's 4 times 1?
5.
4 times 1.
I was doing addition, I'm sorry.
4. What property is that when we multiply by 1?
Commutative.
Multiplicative
I did.
Identity.
Oh, I was right. I was thinking the wrong word.
Multiplicative identity. Wow, all right. It's been a long day, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes. Told you.
this is where we're headed with this lesson. I want you to be able to do step by step, find the property on your sheet. I know you know how to solve stuff, but I want you to find what property you're using from the notes that I just gave you and get it written down, okay?